I met Mr. Willis towards the end of 8th grade. Rowan and I heard about the Crossbridge Scholars Program and how it could replace fall and winter sport requirements freshman year. Later that day, we talked to Mr. Willis, and after 5 minutes, Crossbridge became something that I needed to be a part of. Entering 9th grade, I had no recollection of Mr. Willis. I didn't remember his name, that he was white, young, or had a quite audacious beard. The only thing that I remember was how passionately he spoke about Crossbridge and truly understanding others. As I look back, this is what Mr. Willis has taught me. I no longer let social identifiers cloud my vision of others, but I use them to better understand the environments which shape us. 5 years later, and I finally realized why everyone likes him and why I could imagine no better man to essentially guide me through life. Mr. Willis looks at a room of people and doesn't see the percentages and the colors. Rather, he sees the various elements that make up each individual and hold up the mass. I'm excited to hear from the man who has the power to reach the core of whomever he meets. So please stand to greet my mentor, advisor, comic relief, and friend, Mr. Willis.
Okay, please remain standing. All right, go ahead. You can sit. Show me some respect. When I graduated from college in 2001, which to some of you seems comically recent, and to the rest of you seems like a lifetime ago, I distinctly remember walking across the campus green back to my fraternity and thinking, I will never step foot in a classroom again. I don't think I threw my fist in the air, like a definitive statement, but you can see how well that epiphany worked out for me. How I got from that definitive statement to here is a tale of exploration in me, partially speaking to you today as EA's Upper School Diversity Coordinator. I asked to speak with Vestry about how certain people are portrayed here in chapel, and they in turn asked me to talk to you. So I've been in this position for several years now, and I know what you're thinking. Why is he the diversity coordinator? You look at me and think the position doesn't fit me, and I know why. It's because I'm short. Right? Well, I challenge any of you to a game of basketball right now. Does anyone have a ball? No? Okay. I come from a background that would not seem to scream upper school diversity coordinator to many people. I grew up in a similar community to that of Newtown Square and EA. While I attended a public school, my brothers, father, grandfathers, and uncles all attended the same private boarding school. My high school was significantly larger than EA, but the student body looked much the same. 98 to 99% went on to college, many to elite institutions. Many drove cars of his or her own. Many went to summer camps. Many excelled in athletics, like ice hockey and lacrosse. Many came back from vacations maybe questionably too tan. And most of the students believed that they were fully prepared for the world outside of Ridgefield, Connecticut. That's Ridgefield, not Richfield. I heard that a lot growing up. And then I would feel the need to downplay my parents' successes and my town's affluence. It's fascinating to look at what aspects of our social identity we embrace and what aspects we downplay. Why did I have pride in some aspect but not others? An exercise often used in diversity-related activities is the social identity wheel, where participants rank the 8 main social identifiers in order of importance to her or himself. The purpose is not only to show you what you think is important to yourself, but to show you that diversity truly involves every single one of us. So take a minute and think, what would you rate most important to your identity? Gender, age, religious belief, mental and physical ability, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, or socioeconomic class. If you were to lose your identity one area at a time, what would be the part of your identity that you would cling to? Age? Your gender? Your race? When I ponder this, I wonder, do I see myself as a man first? As heterosexual first? As Christian first? If you could define yourself in only one fashion, how would you do this? The reality is that we don't always have the ability to choose this for ourselves. When I lived in Ridgefield, I thought people developed only one notion of who I was, and then, just as now, saw that as not fair to me or to them. Our society is prone to making snap judgments, usually by certain visual aspects of diversity, those that we can see immediately. There are other aspects of the diversity that, while invisible, are equally important to our identity development. Some of our assumptions are ingrained through parental influence, societal patterns, and even our subconscious. For instance, when the only image you are given of Africans is either the novel Things Fall Apart sophomore year or of war-torn victims in chapel, whether you believe it or not, your subconscious is forming assumptions about people. Our assumptions are at face value, and we're formulating a story about other people's backgrounds. I'd like to show you a small excerpt from a TED Talk by the Nigerian author Chimamanda Adichie called "The Danger of a Single Story," that speaks to just this.
I come from a conventional middle-class Nigerian family. My father was a professor. My mother was an administrator. And so we had, as was the norm, live-in domestic help who would often come from nearby rural villages. So the year I turned 8, we got a new houseboy. His name was Fide. The only thing my mother told us about him was that his family was very poor. My mother sent yams and rice and our old clothes to his family. And when I didn't finish my dinner, my mother would say, "Finish your food. Don't you know people like Fide's family have nothing?" So I felt enormous pity for Fide's family. Then one Saturday, we went to his village to visit. And his mother showed us a beautifully patterned basket made of dyed raffia that his brother had made. I was startled. It had not occurred to me that anybody in his family could actually make something. All I had heard about them was how poor they were, so that it had become impossible for me to see them as anything else but poor. Their poverty was my single story of them. Years later, I thought about this when I left Nigeria to go to university in the United States. I was 19. My American roommate was shocked by me. She asked where I had learned to speak English so well and was confused when I said that Nigeria happened to have English as its official language. She asked if she could listen to what she called my tribal music and was consequently very disappointed when I produced my tape of Mariah Carey. She assumed that I did not know how to use a stove. What struck me was this: she had felt sorry for me even before she saw me. Her default position toward me, as an African, was a kind of patronizing, well-meaning pity. My roommate had a single story of Africa, a single story of catastrophe. In this single story, there was no possibility of Africans being similar to her in any way, no possibility of feelings more complex than pity, no possibility of a connection as human equals. I must say that before I went to the US, I didn't consciously identify as African. But in the US, whenever Africa came up, people turned to me, never mind that I knew nothing about places like Namibia. But I did come to embrace this new identity, and in many ways, I think of myself now as African, although I still get quite irritable when Africa is referred to as a country, the most recent example being my otherwise wonderful flight from Lagos 2 days ago, in which there was an announcement on the Virgin flight about their charity walk in India, Africa, and other countries. So after I had spent some years in the US as an African, I began to understand my roommate's response to me. If I had not grown up in Nigeria, and if all I knew about Africa were from popular images, I too would think that Africa was a place of beautiful landscapes, beautiful animals, and incomprehensible people fighting senseless wars, dying of poverty and AIDS, unable to speak for themselves, and waiting to be saved by a kind white foreigner. I would see Africans in the same way that I, as a child, had seen Fide's family.
I think she has a beautiful way with words, and I greatly appreciate her perspective and willingness to put her own collection of stories forward to help us move forward. She later says, quote, that when we reject the single story, when we realize that there is never a single story about any place, we regain a kind of paradise. Diversity is one way that this can be achieved, but we need to be cautious with how this is presented. Because as a member of our society's majority, I must tell you that there is the archetype of the white savior. But diversity is not a case of whites helping black or brown people because they can't help themselves. That is jaded, and it is a dangerous way to view diversity. It makes us an us versus them type of relationship. Diversity should not be divisive. Rather, it should be inclusive. The chapel theme is with God, all things are possible, but note that it doesn't say things are easy. When you step back and think about identity and in turn diversity this way, you see why our office is called Diversity and Community Life. The purpose of the Diversity and Community Life Office, if I could read the mission, is to foster the emotional intelligence of our faculty, staff, students, and parents through ongoing communication, education, and training about the importance of having a high-level understanding of self and diversity awareness to strive for excellence in all endeavors. You will notice there is no mention of an agenda, nor is there any mention of blame. Diversity work is not meant to cause feelings of guilt unless you have done something to feel guilty for. Rather, this is about making things open, equal, and providing you with the tools to understand your peers fully and encourage you to make the most of the privileged head start you have attending a school like Episcopal. The intent is to help each EA individual foster the awareness that with diversity comes, as the author of Social Intelligence says, a heightened collective creativity and entrepreneurial energy. And if we do our work effectively, you will be able to turn that appreciation into a competitive advantage. I thought I really understood and was aware, but the reality is I did not think about those social identifiers as I left Ridgefield and attended Franklin and Marshall College. Compared to my hometown, the school was certainly more visibly diverse. I wanted to be independent, to leave my hometown and step into what I thought was a well-rounded identity. So, I put up a poster of Dr. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X shaking hands. I thought, you mispronounce my town as Richfield? You do not know me. I'm not what you expected. I didn't like it when people heard where I was from and instantly attached labels to who I was. I thought hanging a poster could change how people saw me. After 4 years of college, I believed that I had truly arrived in understanding all the intricacies of our society. I mean, once you've debated in philosophy class whether a room continues to exist once you've left the room, and you're in the most diverse fraternity on campus, I felt I really got it, that I'd moved beyond the Ridgefield typical kid. The reality is that I still had no idea about diversity and the role privilege played in my life, and my education had really only just begun. I didn't really understand privilege until grad school. After college, I went quickly from a dead-end office job where I endlessly faxed copies of checks to a construction job, living at home with my parents the longest 6 months of my life. I eventually ended up in grad school at Penn working to become a teacher. At first, the very notion of studying how to teach seemed laughable. I wasn't studying the content. At the end of my master's, though, I realized that I was provided a structured, scaffolded approach into understanding how people work, think, and are motivated. I was given an assignment in the first month that more than anything put privilege into concrete perspective for me. Up until this time, the word privilege seemed like a curse word to me. It immediately felt like a prompted attack. This changed when my professor tasked us to research our own family's educational history. In doing so, I was fortunate enough to have a fair amount of genealogy material available to me. I discovered my family first attended elite American universities as far back as the 1700s and continued to primarily attend Yale throughout the 1800s. Many members of my family went on to theological seminary, as most college attendees did at that time, but they also went on to become, among other things, the first governor of Connecticut, a Supreme Court justice, and the first person to lay the telegraph cables across the Atlantic. Other students in my graduate class came back to report on their family past, and the differences were glaring. It's not that I expected everyone to have such an extensive family history. I mean, a branch of my family believes they can trace our genealogy back to Charlemagne. That's a long time ago. But I did expect my peers would be able to trace their roots, that the genealogy existed for them. It was just a matter of finding it. Many of these Ivy League educated educators in the graduate program were either the first in their family to attend college or graduate school, or as often was the case, they had no family history available to them at all. While my family was attending schools and creating histories, other families were, well, they just don't know. Just having genealogy, just having a family history at that moment was a privilege. Then I realized that while I could have made it into the class and Penn's graduate program on my own without my family's educated past, I was in that classroom partially due to the fact that my family had a couple hundred years of education to pass on to later generations. Part of my intelligence certainly derived from my father's intelligence and his father's education and his father's education, etc. Yes, I certainly worked hard to get to where I was, but it was during this time that the concept of privilege became so profound to me. As a prototypical example of our nation's majority, a young, heterosexual, white, Protestant, college-educated, middle-class, perfectly tall, able-bodied male. The head start I had received without even asking for it became blatantly apparent and was in fact always there, whether I recognized it or not. So what do I do with this realization? What's the responsibility I felt I had? Perhaps it is this that led me towards diversity work. I became a teacher to share my love of literature, reading, and writing with younger generations. My father always used to tell me, the English language is a wonderful tool. Learn to use it. That was usually in an insulting fashion because I'd made a mistake. But maybe I'm in diversity work and ultimately at EA to further others' sense of empathy and hopefully enable each student to make the most of his or her position. With this knowledge, all things are possible. This is truly where you come into the picture. If you understand that there is no single story for any one person, then you're ready to grow and become more aware. But as Chimamanda Adichie warns, quote, show a people as one thing, as only one thing over and over again, and that is what they become. Stories are defined by and dependent on power. Power is the ability not just to tell the story of another person, but to make it the definitive story of that person. I realize many people may say diversity work is being overly sensitive, and usually that word has a negative connotation. Frequently, though, it is the people who respond that way who are in a position of power, the position of the majority. And it is truly a privilege to be able to say that things were being blown out of proportion because it doesn't affect you. It is all well and good to say that we are living in a post-racial America, that we, the old heads, are making a big deal out of things that don't exist anymore. I'm in diversity at EA because I grew up in a similar place. Whenever I heard the word diversity growing up, I immediately thought of race. Whenever I heard the phrase white privilege, I immediately thought, I never owned slaves. It's not my fault. I shouldn't be made to feel guilty. When people brought up racism, I would often say something along the lines of, I don't see color. I realized later on in life this is truly a result of privilege. And the fact that we're not seeing it is problematic. The most important thing to realize, though, is that you're not shut out from this just because you're in the majority. You just happen to fit the privilege buckets on the social identity wheel. Since graduate school, I've taught in what I truly believe are some of the most diverse and least diverse areas imaginable. I began my student teaching at Philadelphia's Northeast High School and was so fortunate to be inculcated into education in such an environment. When I was there, the student population of Northeast spoke a total of 54 different languages. I then taught at St. Gabriel's Hall, a juvenile detention facility, which, while it didn't have the linguistic diversity, had a geographical diversity. My third position at Strawberry Mansion High School in Philadelphia was the least diverse environment I had ever been in. The student population was 99% of the same class and of the same race. The fact of the matter is that teaching at Northeast was such a rich experience and that there was such an abundant amount of diversity. And that teaching at Strawberry Mansion was much harder because there was such a lack of diversity. To me, this is the value of diversity. It's an asset to seek out for its inclusiveness and its growth mindset. But if you view diversity as a deficit or as a weakness, you are selling our unique personalities short. I want to show you one more short excerpt.
I recently spoke at a university where a student told me that it was such a shame that Nigerian men were physical abusers like the father character in my novel. I told him that I had just read a novel called American Psycho, and that it was such a shame that young Americans were serial murderers. Now, obviously, I said this in a fit of mild irritation, but it would never have occurred to me to think that just because I had read a novel in which a character was a serial killer, that he was somehow representative of all Americans. And now, this is not because I'm a better person than that student, but because of America's cultural and economic power. I had many stories of America. I had read Tyler, Updike, and Steinbeck, and Gateskill. I did not have a single story of America.
So I chose to close with this clip, not to show you that reading and literature will make you the better person, but rather to show you, as Adichie says, how impressionable and vulnerable we are in the face of a story. Soon, whether 6 months from now or 3.5 years from now, you go forth from EA, you will represent yourself. Not knowing will no longer be a viable option, particularly as our nation's fabric continues to change. The concept of a melting pot is somewhat outdated because we no longer expect people to melt into one vision of an American. You can choose to embrace diversity in its many facets, or you can choose to be obstinate and cling to the past. I chose to teach and persevere in this work because I hope I can help you see the value not just in Ethan Frome, but also in the endless possibilities that come from and with diversity. Dr. King once said, "An individual has not started living until he can rise above the narrow confines of his individualistic concerns to the broader concerns of all humanity." I truly hope that you choose the best story for your futures. Thank you.